first of all, if you haven't seen the video on where I talk about the UCR, definitely go watch that one first, because this is like a direct continuation of that. Because if we're talking about crime data and sort of where we can get crime data, the UCR is a great one for if we are looking for official crime statistics, official crime data, crime reported to police. However, there has been a major change recently that's going to make this next one much more relevant, which is the NIBERS, the National Incident-Based Reporting System. So NIBRS is actually a subset of the UCR, of the Uniform Crime Report, and but it's more of an incident-based reporting system, hence the name. So like the UCR, it is voluntarily provided by some police departments, but far fewer comparatively. And but the big sort of change is that NIBRS is actually now the only way to gather UCR data as of the 1st of January 2021. So this is a very recent change, but we still have to sort of know enough about the UCR to know what everything prior to 2021, all of that data means. But that was sort of the more basic, what was called the summary reporting system, the SRS. That has been phased out now. And so now, in order for police departments to submit data, it has to go, they have to do the full NIBRS route, which the reason that they didn't, not as many did it before, is because this data is way better, but that also means it takes way more time for police officers to actually fill out the paperwork. And so that was the big problem, is that to submit this information, it takes a lot more police resources and time. However, what it does makes it so worth it, at least from a research perspective, because what it does is it fixes a lot of the methodological issues associated with the UCR, and because it allows for the calculation of multiple offenses, multiple victims, multiple arrests within a single incident. So that was the hierarchy rule that was the drawback of the UCR. That basically disappeared with NIBRS. So now if you have a single incident that has multiple perpetrators or multiple crimes taking place within it, all of those things are counted and all of those things are documented. So it also includes a lot more offenses than the UCR, so it doesn't stick only to those Part 1 crimes, which is what the UCR does, at least the SRS of the UCR does. However, it's not... Prior to this sort of change that happened in January of 2021, it was not widely implemented at all. Only about 17% of police departments actually reported it because it has such a complicated, much more time-consuming reporting system. So I'm hoping moving forward that this means we're going to have a lot more buy-in from police departments for the NIBRS system, and so that means we're going to get a lot more NIBRS data. However, what I hope it doesn't mean is that we're going to lose the police departments that were reporting with the SRS, the UCR, the general UCR, but don't want to put the extra effort forward to do NIBRS. So I feel like it's going to be a combination of that, but we're going to have to basically wait years, possibly decades, to sort of see what those patterns end up looking like. The NIBRS fixes a lot of problems from the UCR, the original SRS system, but I mean, I guess we're going to see if we end up having the sample size that or at least a comparative sample size that we have had in previous years with UCR data. Another way that we can gather crime data is just through survey research. So this is basically any research team that creates it could be a paper survey, it could be in person, it could be electronic survey, but where you can basically tailor the survey to ask about attitudes, beliefs, values, characteristics, experiences with crime or victimization. So if we look at victimization surveys, then that's asking about victimization versus self-report surveys, which is asking about perpetration. Survey research can incorporate either of those things. But a big thing about surveys is not only can you sort of ask essentially whatever you want as long as it's ethical, but you can also, it also then means that you have to make sure that you have a representative sample. And so the sample, usually if you want a representative sample, it has to be done through random sampling or some element of random sampling. But there are ways that if you want a targeted sample, you can do that as well. but you want it to be representative of at least the population that you want to talk about. That might not be the entire population, but you want it to be representative of whatever larger group you're going to talk about. So it's great that you can sort of tailor research, but there's a lot of variability in what constitutes survey research. One of the biggest ones is the National Crime Victimization Survey. So this is a large, nationally representative sample. So this is conducted by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, the BJS, and they go to approximately 135,000 households, which covers about 225,000 individuals. So this is a large sample, and they do it through a relatively random method. So in order to choose who they go to survey. So what they do is they get the sample, then for every 6 months for a 3-year period, they go back to those same households. And so the same households are going to get multiple surveys. And the reason for this is so that there's a short recall period of only the 6 months, so they can say, has anything happened to you since the last time we were here? And they'll ask all the questions about victimization and experiences with victimization, but they only have to think about like the last 6 months as opposed to thinking about lifetime victimization, which creates a lot more troubles in terms of remembering and validity. So that's why they want to go back and so they can sort of see if the same households have encountered any kind of victimization within just the past 6 months. So they gather victimization information for both the individuals as well as the household. So they'll ask about personal victimization against the person, but also against the household. So if there was like a B&E, a burglary, then that would be the household is the victim in that situation, or vandalism or something like that. The NCVS is great because it includes not only unreported crimes, which is, if we think back to the crime funnel, which was discussed at the beginning of the previous video, the UCR video, then we're tapping into that dark figure of crime. That is one of the best things of the NCVS, is that we are tapping into that dark figure of crime. So we're starting to get some of that unreported crimes that things like the UCR and NIBERS cannot tap into, because by definition, they come from police departments, so they can only represent reported crimes. So great thing about the NCVS is that it includes unreported crimes, but also there are questions about whether or not the person reported whatever happened to them, and if they didn't, why. So we can actually start to figure out why people aren't reporting, so that we can work to improve those reporting rates, because we want high reporting rates. It would be great if everybody reported every crime against them. From a statistical standpoint, police departments would be overrun and there would not be enough resources. But from a research standpoint, we want everybody to be reporting. And I mean, even the police departments, if they had everybody reporting, then they could prioritize things, and so they would at least be able to tap into sort of knowing and investigating things that they have the time to report that meet a certain level of severity or what have you. So I think it's in everybody's best interest that all crime gets reported, but that's never going to happen realistically. But if we can learn why people don't report, we can fix some of those problems, and that's what the NCVS kind of lets us do to some extent. So some advantages of the NCVS is that it's estimating the total amount of annual crimes, including unreported crimes. So that's the major advantage, tapping into that dark figure of crime. We get information on why crimes are not reported. And so there are a variety of reasons why crimes are not reported. There are some disadvantages, though. The first being that victim reports are not always reliable, in the sense that there can be either over-reporting or under-reporting. So over-reporting could happen if victims interpret events as crimes that weren't actually crimes. So if somebody lost their wallet and they reported it to the NCVS as it being stolen, then they're reporting a crime that never actually happened. And also over-reporting can happen because people will report a crime that happened years ago as having been more recent within the past, that 6-month recall period. So that's a problem too, because I mean, sometimes it'd be like, oh, well, have you ever had like anything stolen from you, like a vehicle or a bike or whatever? And if I'm like, oh yeah, I had a bike stolen from me, but really that happened years ago. But if I'm like, oh no, but that happened to me, and so I like report it, and then I'm like, only later I'm like, oh yeah, well, that was like years ago, but oh well, that's going to mean that that crime has now been over-reported. However, there's also under-reporting because of what's called socially desirable responding sometimes, and that's basically that if we we want people to think of us a certain way, and we also want to think about ourselves a certain way. So any kind of survey research has to sort of deal with this idea of social desirable responding, where you want the truth from people, even if it's like an uncomfortable truth. And so if people are embarrassed about, you know, being like duped or something as a victim of a crime, or they don't want to admit being victimized, then they're not going to tell you that. So sometimes that could happen. Sometimes they just forget that something happened, and it just they don't remember that something happened. Or sometimes they'll fear getting into trouble, so they don't want to necessarily report, even to, you know, the NCVS people who are not police officers. They are just researchers, but they still don't want to say, oh, well, you know, because I was like, you know, doing something I wasn't supposed to do when I was victimized. You know, I was getting high with friends or whatever when I was victimized, and so they don't want to report that. So that can be a problem as well. Another major disadvantage is that there's no information on victims under the age of 12. So for, you know, ethical reasons, they do not interview anybody under the age of 12. However, that means that we're missing all of the crime that's perpetrated against victims under the age of 12. And I mean, part of that is because to interview children is a completely different process. But once somebody, I mean, 12 is still a child, but you can sort of talk to them and ask them questions and they understand you. When you're dealing with really young children, you have to ask questions in a completely different way and go about it a different way. So it would be actually a completely different methodology if we're going to focus on children. So it's understandable why these NCVS does this, but it also means we're missing that information. So there are some other ways that we can get crime data through self-report surveys. And so self-report surveys, as I mentioned, is when we're asking about criminal perpetration as opposed to victimization. And so there are flaws here in reporting accuracy that are all very similar to victimization reports. Plus, add in the extra, you know, that you're expecting honesty about something that somebody has done that's a criminal or deviant act. And that means that we are now asking people who have perpetrated some kind of crime to be honest about that. When if we go back to socially desirable responding, they're not going to want to tell you about what is potentially the worst thing they've ever done. But also, you're expecting honesty from people who may not necessarily be honest people. If the more crime they've perpetrated, then probably the less honest they're going to be about it. And then also, you may miss out on the most criminal population, because if it's the non-criminals are going to be the ones that you're most likely to interview. Because if you think about something like, you know, even asking for, because yeah, it's voluntary participation. You can't force people to participate. And so that means that the people who are the most criminal are probably the most likely people that are going to be like, nah, I don't want to do that. But also if it's something like you're going into a school and you're going to survey people randomly at a school, they're probably the ones most likely to be skipping that day, right? So the people with the most offenses are probably the least likely to either be there where you're sampling from or to want to participate. So there are some issues with self-report surveys, but you know, they doesn't mean that they're not good sources of data.